I'd just like to begin today's session by acknowledging the people upon whose land I meet today. So I'd like to acknowledge that the country that I'm meeting with you from is owned by the Muinina people, who are traditional custodians of the land, which is now also called Hobart. I pay my respects to the elders past and honour them, who unfortunately did not survive colonisation, but I'd like to honour their contribution to knowledge. I honour and pay my respects to the Palawa people of Tasmania and their elders past and present. My name is Paul Tomaszewski. I'm a researcher with the University of New South Wales, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming along and joining this presentation today. Today we have Karen Fisher and Megan Blaxland from the Social Policy Research Centre at the University of New South Wales, and also Sally Robinson from Flinders University. Karen, Megan and Sally will talk to us for approximately 45 minutes, and there'll be also an opportunity for question and answers at the end of today's session. Just before I hand over to Karen in the first instance, just a couple of things from a housekeeping perspective. We have, and just a reminder to everyone, if you can please mute yourselves, other than presenters, of course, it would be very helpful for everyone if you could unmute yourself when it comes time to speak. We'd also appreciate if you can identify yourself in the chat line. If you have any questions throughout today's presentation, either during the presentation or after the presentation, please feel free to use the chat function. There should be hopefully an opportunity to run through all of those questions at the end of today's presentation. Today we've got the auto captions function on, so you can turn that on by clicking the CC closed caption button towards the right hand side at the bottom of your screen. And finally, the seminar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube. A link will be emailed within the week to everyone who has registered, so please keep that in mind, particularly in relation to question and answers, as that will all be available publicly, but the link will be sent out to everyone at the conclusion of today's presentation. So without further ado, I'm handing over to Karen. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paul. I too would like to start by acknowledging I'm on Bedegal land at the university campus. We have the benefit of learning from Indigenous ways of knowing from the First Peoples who are in the community and in the university community, and it contributes to the quality of our research and policy. I'd also like to acknowledge the members of our research team who aren't here today: Rosemary Kays, Frances Quant-Farrant and Christiana Perkle. So we're going to talk about the very important question today of self-managed plans in the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS. As we know, the NDIS has moved from being something that's being implemented, started almost 10 years ago now in 2013, and is now at a point where there's lots of complaints and suggestions on how to do things better. And self-managed plans is one of those opportunities where we hope that there's a chance for change into the future. And so this research that we're going to talk about today, we hope will contribute to that. I'm just going to work out how to move on. Here we go. So the things that we're going to talk about are a brief explanation of the NDIS and self-management. Then Megan's going to talk about the take-up of the NDIS self-managed plans and the profile that we see from the data. Sally will talk about the experience of people who self-manage in making self-managed plans work for them. And then we'll draw some conclusions about what that means for supporting choices for other people who don't currently self-manage, and perhaps that self-management may be useful for them in the future. So the NDIS has two main parts, and most of the publicity is about the first part, and that's the bit we'll talk about today. But I do think it is worth mentioning that that's only one part of NDIS. So individual plans, so that's where somebody is assessed as being eligible for funding to support disability specialist services and equipment, is aimed at about 10% of people with disability who have permanent and significant disability. And so that funding package is called a plan, and they have a choice of 3 ways to manage it. We're going to talk about the first way today, where the money is allocated to the person into an account and then they decide how to spend it. That's called self-management. The second option is where there's a financial manager, and that's called a plan manager. And the third is where the NDIA, or the agency, manages the plan. So whichever way you choose to manage your plan, you can use it to buy services from the market. That's from non-government organisations or private professionals or companies, or you can employ people. And the greatest choice is anticipated to be if you self-manage plans. So it's in a way, the purest sense of choice and control potential under the NDIS legislation. But most people with disability, that is 90% of people with disability, continue to rely on referral to mainstream services like anyone else in Australia. So that's your health, your education, employment, those types of services that other people would expect to use. And it also includes case management, information, peer support, capacity building, community development, all of those other things that make the 10% individual packages work, but also accessing services for any person with disability and the people around them who support them. The details of all of that are on the NDIS website, and also importantly, I think, linked to many of the peer support social media sites. In Australia, NDIS is only about services and equipment. Income support, such as the disability support pension, is a different scheme. So turning specifically to NDIS self-management, we did research with self-managers to find out 2 things. First is, what's the profile of people with disability who self-manage their plans so far? And second, what was their experience and what helps them to self-manage successfully? We used 2 methods. The first was secondary analysis of NDIS quarterly data that they make public 4 times a year about the rates of self-management. And the second was interviews with 9 people who self-manage, including parents who do that with the people with disability. And those were people in 3 states with a range of ages, types of disability, and levels of experience with self-management. We looked at that data through a framework designed by Katzman and Kinsella in the UK about the types of work of self-management. And you'll see as we present the results why that framework is so important. They say there are 3 types of work. The first is administrative work. So that's sort of the paperwork that you expect when you're going to spend some money. The second is supplemental work. So how to make that good. For example, how do you manage and employ people who provide your support? And the third is the most difficult. How do you navigate uncertainties? How do you overcome problems and emergencies? And the reason why Katzman and Kinsella said this framework is so important, and in fact what you'll see, is that most people, when they anticipate self-management, think only of the first part. And in fact, most of the resources are only about the first part. How do you actually do this? Whereas the difficulties are in the second and third. And so looking at specifically at the Australian context, this research examines how people here have experienced those 3 types of work. So I'll now hand to Megan to talk about what we know about the profile of people with disability who self-manage.
Thank you, Karen. So I am presenting some analysis that we did based on NDIS administrative data, as Karen said, from September 2019. And this material is available on a report that's published on the SBRC website. So you can have a look at it in more detail if you'd like to. So to start with, sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me again? Yep. So to start with, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what self-management looks like. So you can see here that 18% of plans were completely self-managed. So people managed all of the funds that were allocated to them. And then another 12% were partly self-managed. So people managed some of their funds and the other part of their funds were managed in a different way, either plan or agency managed. Interestingly, over time, from 2013, when the NDIS started, up until 2019, the rates of self-management increased strongly and steadily. But since 2019, when I looked at the data most recently, it's been quite steady at about 30% of people doing some or all self-management of their plans. And you can see here also that the budget of a fully self-managed plan is on average much lower than other plan types at $25,000. Partly self-managed plans are higher, $65,000. It is quite a lot more, but still not as high as the plan managed plans and the agency managed plans. Next, thanks, Karen. So then we had a look at how self-management differed across different jurisdictions to see whether there were patterns in the data that might point to other things, some of the things are going on that shape the reasons why people self-manage or not. And you can see here, Karen, if you click on, that self-management ranged in across the states and territories from 11% in Western Australia, and then again, Karen, to 33% in the ACT. So a huge difference. And then if we look at partly self-managed plans, you can see here, Karen, it goes from 6% in the NT and 7% in South Australia to as high as 23%, Karen, if you could click again, in Western Australia. So there's an enormous amount of variation there across the jurisdictions. And then we had a look on the next slide at how self-management varies across the different NDIS disability groups. So there are quite a number of these groups, and we've clustered them into these 4 categories. And then if we click on, you can see that fully self-managed plans are most common among people with sensory or psychosocial disability, about a quarter of all of those. And in partly self-managed plans, it's about the greatest number is amongst those in the sensory or physical disability group categories, which is about a fifth of all of those people. When we delved into this in a little bit more detail, we were interested to find that of all the disability groups, the ones with the largest proportion of fully self-managed plans was autism, and that was at 30%, so considerably higher than these. And then looking at that in more detail again, we realised that actually nearly half of all fully self-managed plans were held by people with autism. And of those, nearly all of those plans were managed for children aged 0 to 18 years old. So managed typically by parents for their children. So that means that almost half of all fully self-managed plans were managed by parents for children with autism. So we wanted to understand more about these patterns in the data and what's driving the variations across disability type that we saw here and across the states and territories, as we saw in the previous plan. And so Sally's going to talk in the next section about how self-management works, for participants, because this gives us insights into why self-management is more prevalent in some situations than others. Over to you, Sally.
Thanks, Megan. I just want to acknowledge to you all that I'm coming from Ghana lands today. I'm down in Adelaide, so you're getting a full national experience. I'm going to talk to you about the qualitative work and the way that we analysed it according to the Katzman and Kinsella framework. I do want to emphasise to you that Megan's work was analysing the data. The qualitative work is a small sample. So really what we did with this piece of research was to set out to, we thought that there was something worth investigating here. It's a small piece of research that looks to scratch the itch to see, is there something here that's worth pursuing? And that's what we're talking to you about today. We don't want to overstate the significance of what we're talking to you about today. We know that we're talking to an audience that knows a lot more about self-management than we do in large parts, especially the people who are self-managing. So I really don't want to set out and talk to you today like I'm the fount of all wisdom on this, because I'm definitely not. We're having a conversation with you about the things that other people have told us and what we think is worth continuing to pursue. So in this experience of administrative work, which is this first category about accountability, this is the things that Katzman and Kinsella call the administration, like Karen said, the paperwork, but also the things about human resources, about accounting, about making sure that money is spent properly and ethically. People reported that they felt generally positive about this part of the scheme because there was some information about it. They talked about having increased choice and control. They felt that they had positive experiences, particularly because there wasn't a mediator between them and the experience of spending their funds. Particularly, people appreciated being able to get value for money out of their purchases and being able to have choice about where they purchase things. Very simple things. Like one person talked about being able to buy a grab stick and to be able to get that from Bunnings, rather than having to go to a specialist occupational therapy provider. And his grab stick was $8 instead of $108. So those sorts of things were really reinforcing and validating for people. And you can see the quote there from Diane, where she said, these are all pseudonyms, of course, you feel like you manage your own life. We all manage our own life. We pay our bills. I just have a few extra bills because I have a disability. So of course, this was not a universal experience. People who had previous experience and who had related skills, life experience and life skills around administration, around accounting, around management kinds of activities, had a lot more ease in administrative work. So people's previous experience in related domains made it much easier for them to do the administrative work. Where people didn't have previous experience and they didn't have those related skills, it was much more overwhelming for them to deal with the administration of the scheme. And where people didn't have that past capacity, it was more difficult. But there were things that people did. Of course, they had strategies to deal with the weight of administration. Some people outsourced administrative responsibilities. Where people's packages were big enough, that was a really sustainable thing for them to do. Where people had small packages or where their packages reduced unexpectedly, outsourcing the administration was problematic. People built support networks, peer support networks or informal support networks, the way that they used relationships with service providers in some cases made a difference to how they found out about the ways that they could manage their accountability responsibilities. And people increased their level of confidence in managing accountability through just doing it, becoming familiar with it, becoming confident by doing. And finding ways that it became less onerous over time. It was definitely the case, though, that people who had a socioeconomic advantage were advantaged around administrative work. If we can move on to the next slide, Karen, the experience of supplemental work. This second type of work that's in the Katzman and Kinsella framework is about the sort of tasks that are involved in becoming competent in self-management. So these are the sorts of things that people talked about were about learning how to self-manage, but also about finding innovative solutions, about training workers, about peer support and peer training that they did themselves and they also received, and also the way that they self-advocated when it came time for reviews and planning meetings, for meeting with allied health practitioners and so on. The kinds of experiences that people had were that they talked about that there was much more work than they expected in learning to self-manage. They hadn't anticipated as much work, and there was less explanation and less support than they had expected when they came into self-management. People talked about relationship building and how important that was. Learning about building relationships with people who are also self-managing, and how many tips and tricks people shared with each other to manage the systems and the processes, but also the importance of relationships with service providers to do things like minimise the impact of staff turnover, and the importance of relationships with advocates and as self-advocates. Dealing with the NDIA was a huge theme, as you would imagine, all the way through this research. And people talked about how assertive they needed to be as self-advocates, or how they needed to get support from other people as advocates, particularly around changes to NDIA's plans. Edwina says here in a quote, there was actually no guidance apart from here's your plan. No one ever went through the portal. No one ever went through the obligations of self-managing and the accountability of it. So that was quite common for several people who were part of this research, that they really had to find their own way through the processes. There wasn't a guide through it. Conditions and resources around that were that organised support promoted more access to self-management. And the implication of that is that support coordination really can improve people's access, or equalise the access that people have to self-management. It's another case of people who are doing well out of the scheme. The thing that helped people who didn't already have lots of resources was access to practical tools and personalised support. So people talked about the usefulness of workshops and training and mentoring as ways to learn to manage their experience of self-management. The most useful organised supports address both this kind of supplemental work and the administrative work together. They address both of those things, the administrative side of managing, but also the operational side of managing. If we go to the next slide, Karen, which is about the third part of the framework, which is the experience of navigating uncertainties. This is the sort of more abstract side of it, but I'm sure the side that's very familiar to everybody who is dealing day to day with self-management and with the agency. It's the things that that are happening in the everyday and in the sort of the guts of the scheme, I suppose. Managing workers, managing when workers don't turn up, managing budgets, managing what happens when plans change, all of the unexpected situations and risks that happen, including the need for unpaid supports that happen when paid supports are not working. So the kinds of experiences that people talked about was the impact of continual change in rules and processes that come through the NDIA, and not being able to feel the impact of not being able to feel sure about relying on a process and needing to go back and check all the time because processes change so much. That sort of apprehension around that. And then that also applied to the fact that workers turned over a lot. People had lots of change happening in their lives anyway by virtue of the circumstances that they were living with, and inconsistent advice when they rang up for advice too. So a sort of environment where there was a lot of change and churn happening. One of the real examples around that was finding support workers in an emergency. Lots of people talked about how difficult that was, and COVID really heightened that because it became much harder to find workers, and there was a much stronger need to find workers. The financial and ethical accountability for self-management really worried people. People were worried about properly accounting for funds. They were anticipating being audited, and they had minimal help from the agency to alleviate the stress of that. So people didn't really know what to expect. And people also commented on the fact that they felt that the processes that were sitting around self-management undermined their authority. They felt that allied health reports and bureaucratic decisions that went on higher up the decision-making tree were given more authority than their own contribution. And the conditions and resources that sat around that were that people were best equipped to handle uncertainty when they were confident in their capacity to self-manage. But some of the things, those uncertainties really undermined people's confidence in their capacity to self-manage. People planned and prepared and collaborated very carefully to set up the conditions to support their self-management. Things like peer support and training really helped people to build confidence to manage uncertainties because they had it put more and more in their sort of their toolkit to manage those sorts of uncertainties. But people talked about very extensive planning for review meetings and other meetings with NDIA and health professionals and so on. Collaboration and shared decision-making was another strategy that people really drew on. So, for example, before they made big purchases, several people talked about how they would get input from other people involved in particularly young people's lives, but also peers and advocacy networks so that they weren't making big decisions without gathering input. We might turn now to the next slide, thanks Karen, to look at some of the implications of these findings about supporting choice that people make about whether to self-manage or not. The secondary data that Megan spoke to us about shows that there's a really unequal take-up of self-management. Self-managed plans were on average smaller than other plans, and children through their nominees were more likely to use self-management than adults. And the profile of people with disability who self-manage the NDIS plan was skewed towards parents of young children with autism who are entering the NDIS as their first point of contact with disability support. Almost half of the self-managed plans, just to remind you, were parents managing for their young children. And by contrast, only about 1 in 10 participants with cognitive disability self-manage their plan, and even fewer were people with intellectual disability. So there's that real unequal take-up that's evident in the secondary data. Looking at the three-part framework of administrative, supplemental and uncertainty work from Katzman and Kinsella, I think was really useful for understanding the degree to which socioeconomic capacity affected people's confidence to self-manage, and for understanding the kind of resources that they need to redress any imbalance. In their original work in the UK, Katzman and Kinsella demonstrated that self-management can have benefits, but it can also be problematic in the way that it shifts responsibility and risk onto people. We've applied that typology to the current conditions in Australia that facilitate or hinder self-management. And while people who self-manage so that they benefited from the additional choices that it facilitated, their experience also revealed unequal capacity to take on the three types of self-management. And socioeconomic advantage and previous experience really assisted participants to self-manage successfully. And people who had these capacities could locate and use methods and systems to manage the administrative and the supplementary work. And they had the confidence and the connections to anticipate and manage uncertainties including self-advocating for their rights. The people who didn't have those socioeconomic advantages sometimes had access to other resources that eased the work of self-management. And those resources were things like support from advocacy organisations and peers. And those resources really helped people to take up the choice to self-manage and to get competence to manage those three types of work, and to build confidence to self-advocate for their entitlement to changes to their NDIS packages so that they better met their needs. But people really emphasise the need for extra support, more support to begin to self-manage. Some of the examples of support that were helpful that they gave were support coordination and mentoring, training, peer support, advocacy organisations, and funds for outsourcing part of the self-management work. People talked about how support was particularly important if the person didn't have a business background or a bookkeeping background to draw on. Starting with self-managing part of their funds was one approach that some people had taken that they found helpful. People also noted, though, that the system needed to avoid merely shifting responsibility and risks from government or service providers onto people with disability. And people need support to make choices and to access support that helps them to sustainably self-manage. The two data sources in this piece of research indicate how attempts to improve the take-up and the success of self-management might be targeted towards addressing inequalities among people who are considering the choice to self-manage all or some of their disability support, especially people with cognitive disability who are generally excluded at present. We think the findings have got implications for change at different levels, from the policy, at the personal through to the policy and conceptual levels. They inform personal choices about control of disability support, practice changes in service organisations, and policy changes about how people can be supported to make choices about and set up sustainable self-management processes. We set out really with this research to understand how otherwise invisible work of self-management might inform efforts to improve the sustainability of self-management plans without placing too much risk and too much responsibility on people with disability for managing their support. And unless people are aware of these layers of work and have techniques for managing them, there's a risk that people are going to get dissatisfied with self-management and revert to providers for organising their support. So we think that there is a space here for future research that looks at a whole range of different things, like digital platforms that are emerging to cope with self-management, access to needed services, how you manage and find different service types, the difference between self-management for yourself and self-management by a nominee parent, and how the sort of social, economic and civic opportunities for achieving preferences and goals and outcomes are realised within these frameworks that are really important for people. I might pull up there. Karen, is there anything you'd like to add before we pass over for questions?
No, I think I've just put it on to the last slide where the outputs from this project are publicly available on the website. These slides will be distributed with the recording after the seminar, and also the reference to the Katzman and Kinsella report, which I think is very helpful here. And then anyone is, of course, very welcome to contact us after the seminar. But what we'd really like to do now is to turn back to the audience. As Sally said, we know that there are many experts here today, and particularly people speaking from their own experience of self-management or other forms of NDIS plan management would be a very helpful contribution. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karen, Megan and Sally. So now's an opportunity for people, if you have any questions, and there are some questions that are popping up in the chat function. Otherwise, if people feel more comfortable, happy if people want to raise a hand by using the reactions function, and we can go through those questions if people wanted to speak themselves. So the first question here is from Nissa. I hope I've got that name correctly. If you wanted to ask that question yourself, you're welcome to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I can ask that for you. I'll just give you a couple of moments if you wanted to unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks, Paul. Yeah, I was just, I'm a financial counsellor, so I'm asking on behalf of clients, I suppose, that come to see me looking for assistance, and just sort of wondering where I might point them as a starting point to look at how they might manage their plans or where they might get support.
Thanks, Nissa. It's Karen here. I think there are two parts to answering that question. One is the administrative process of doing it. So you need to have approval from the NDIA to self-manage. And so that means going through the plan management process to seek approval for it. And then secondly, I think a more useful answer to that is also that making that decision, as you've seen from what we found in the research, needs to be an informed decision. And although there's a lot of information on the NDIS website about that, what the research participants said to us was that the most useful information was to actually speak to people who are already self-managing, and that comes through mainly through advocacy groups, but also any other more informal peer support groups. I see that Ray has put up her hand, so hopefully, Ray, you can also add to that.
No, thank you. Firstly, really good presentation. Thanks. That was really informative, and it's a good piece of work there on managing or looking at, self-management, why people are using it and moving towards it or not. So that's going to be an important part of the NDIS. I think moving forward, if the scheme is really going to sort of, have its vision of what choice and control is and sort of choice making for the individual, and it's a really important element of the scheme that we've got to, promote and progress and develop and keep going. So yeah, good research. I was just going to, just give a personal account of, I'm TAC, but we've got exactly the same structure set up as a self-management thing. And the issues we're currently finding is the structure of the self-management works fine, but the workforce is just, crunching within that. So even, you've got choice of different service providers under self-management. But when you ring the providers or speak to the providers, they've just got no staff at the moment. So the structure's actually working okay. The administration's working okay, but as you'd see on the news today, the labour shortages just across the field, and particularly in disability, means that responsibility is falling back onto the participant a little bit when there's just like no workers, when you literally ring the provider and they go, I haven't got anyone. Good luck, try and find, maybe some, informal support or something else that's getting to that level. So that's not so much self-management or plan management, but it's just, you can have all of the structures of self-management sitting there working well, all the admin done, know the system and know the portal, and still you're struggling with your service provision because of staffing. So just wanted to raise that as a discussion point. Thanks.
Thank you, Ray. And I see, Adrian, you've put in a useful tip in the chat. Did you want to speak to that?
Sure, and look, thank you for having me and thanks for running this. So I work for the Physical Disability Council of New South Wales in an ILC project, Information Linkages and Capacity Building Project. So we're funded to run a whole bunch of stuff, and we do peer mentoring and peer facilitating. So a lot of that is often assisting people with NDIS access, but we run a number of workshops that we've developed, one of which is around capacity building for NDIS self-management. And by the end of the workshop, we want to give people the skills to go, you know what, this might be too hard. You know what, I might like to try a bit of it. You know what, I'm going to have a red hot go. So yeah, we run those workshops. It was supposed to be an in-person project, but of course we started right at the beginning of the pandemic. So we quickly transformed to online workshops, and So we run also, and I was greatly gratified to see you're talking about self-advocacy and speaking up, because in combination with the NDIS self-management is learning how to self-advocate and learning how to speak up and have your rights heard, how to negotiate, how to be assertive. And so I apologize for giving a pitch, but I just felt that what we're doing ties in nicely with what you're saying about what works and what doesn't. So for everybody, for the 90 odd people on here, if that sounds like something appropriate for the people that you work with, we're no longer bound by state borders. Our funder said, you're in a pandemic, so go for it. So yeah, please feel free to get in touch. I've put the link to our workshops, but you can find me and my colleagues in our team through there. So thanks for letting me have a platform.
Thank you, Adrian. And it's Karen. I think one of the important things to re-emphasize here too is, of course, the people in the interviews mentioned this wherever they were based in Australia. So most of the advocacy organisations are either running these types of capacity building activities themselves, or can refer you to your own local one, so that you can make contact with people near you who are facing similar problems.
There's another couple of questions that have come through. Kay Boucher, I don't have a first name listed there, but if you'd like to talk to your question, I'll give you a couple of moments if you wanted to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'm happy to read that out.
Oh, sorry about that. I was starting to write it and accidentally hit the submit button before I finished. I was just interested to hear in the data showed that it was most common for people with a psychosocial disability to fully self-manage the plan. I was wondering if there was any further breakdown of that data, because what we see on the ground anecdotally is that people with a psychosocial disability who quite often have complex needs as well, so other comorbidities or multiple morbidities, don't have the I guess capacity to self-manage, and also are generally isolated, so don't have the social networks around them to support that. So I was just really interested to see that that data was actually showing the opposite. Or my second question to that, is the autism scooped up in that data?
Sorry, I lost my unmute button for a moment there. I had the cat sitting over the top of it. Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Yes, we do have more detail on that. So if you follow those links that Karen provided in the report that we've written about this, we break it down in a much more fine-grained way so that you can see that. I think what you're pointing to is probably correct, that you know, there are a number of different groups that are clustered together there, and so the kind of it became a quite large category when we made it into something we could fit on the slides to show you. I don't know if Karen or Sally, you wanted to add something to that.
Yes, you're right. The psychosocial disability group is actually quite small compared to others. But if you put your email in the chat to me, I can send that to you directly too.
Right, thank you.
We also had a question from Peter Dean, and again, offer you the opportunity to speak to your question or unmute yourself, and we'll just give you a moment if you'd prefer to do that, or I can read that out for you.
Oh, thank you very much. Just curious and seeing that data come across the page about that difference in regards to uptake within the states. Clearly, I assume there's some cultural things going on. You may have ideas about what's informing or what's underlying that data. But I guess too, I'm a plan nominee, and I guess I've seen some things within the system that suggests that the way that the NDIS works on a state basis seems to actually have manifestly substantive impacts on how one winds up experiencing the NDIS, which is a bit surprising regarding the fact that it's a federal scheme. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Peter. It's Karen. Yes, you're right. And I think a lot of that comes from what you've pointed to, that the local conditions in terms of accessing the scheme vary substantially. So it's a very bureaucratic process where there are not only the National Disability Insurance Agency, which is common across Australia, but varies in the way that it acts in each state or territory, but also the preliminary process through the local area coordinator, and which report to the NDIA, and that's a contracted service which also varies across states. And so the way that those organisations, even before you get to the service providers, each of them operate differently and have a different policy culture in each state. And so I think Megan's data analysis really highlights this. Does somebody know that they can self-manage? Are they supported to make an informed decision about self-managing? Are they supported to learn how to self-manage? Are they supported to solve problems with self-management? And so those policy conditions affect each part of that. I think if we are able to continue with this research program, then we will definitely need to explore that further, because we need to learn from where it's being done best in terms of people making informed decisions that work in their interests.
And it's Megan here. If I could just add too, that I think some of the difference between the states and territories is also about the socioeconomic standing of participants, which Sally's interviews highlighted as well. So we know, for example, that in the ACT, that, you know, levels of education and income tend to be higher than in other parts of the country, and that was the jurisdiction that had the highest rates of fully self-managed plans. And we could see that in the NT, I'm going to get the details wrong now, but, you know, the NT was one of the jurisdictions with very low rates. And we know that people in that jurisdiction tend to not have the same socioeconomic standing as in the ACT. So I think that's part of the story as well.
This is a question, not an answer, but I'm wondering whether there's still a historical tale from the way that the states and the federal government interacted, and the way people came into the scheme, the way the states came into the scheme too, because each of the states were very different in the way that they entered the scheme.
We have a couple of comments from Helen Dickinson, and again, give you the opportunity if you wanted to talk to this yourself, Helen.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone. That's a great presentation on a really, really important issue. It was just a comment that our research, the psychosocial insights are particularly interesting, given some work we did recently looking at budget utilisation, given all the debate around the NDIS last year was around kind of plan allocation. We did some work around budget utilisation, and people with psychosocial disability often have low rates of plan utilisation. So I just thought that was really interesting, given the high numbers in there, and probably reflects some of the challenges and the lack of specialist supports in there. So it seems to me like there's a lot left to unpack there. But yeah, I just wanted to say great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. It's Karen. So what Helen is alluding to there is that when you get allocated your money, you then have to spend it, which you would have thought would be the easy part, but in fact often it's not, partly because what Ray was speaking about before in terms of actually finding someone available to provide the service that you need, but also more specifically that part of the point of having these choices is to find the person or the type of support that meets your particular needs. And so that process of finding the right support is not unique to self-management, but is across the plans. That it's actually very difficult, especially if you are not a person who is used to having suitable support, to work out how to do that. Again, it's an area where there's formal advice from the NDIS, but we know from other research that people like Helen and ourselves are doing, that a lot of that matching up of finding matching between needs and support comes from the advocacy and peer support and mentoring that the disability community itself is organising. Ray, did you want to add something?
I was just going to say one of the, I guess, incentives for people to use self-management is that you can use the non-registered providers. I guess to just sort of the discussion around, in a way, it's provides a bit more transparency because of cost, because with the non-registered providers, they have to go to the client first and the client has to approve the pricing and the usage of the service before they make the payment, whereas with the NDIS providers, the claim just goes straight through onto the portal, from my understanding. So self-management actually provides an extra level of transparency for the client to be able to see the costs. So that we should be sort of pushing that a little bit as a you know, an incentive and an advantage to self-management, because the client's reviewing the costs a bit more rather than just this, you know, blind process happening of service payment with the provider. So that's just another discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. So for those of you not familiar with NDIS, the registered providers are those that are registered with NDIS as an organisation. And over the last couple of weeks, there's been quite a bit of controversy about that in the media because of fraud. And at one stage, the government equating fraud with registration or not, whereas Ray has pointed out, of course, that's not necessarily the case, because the unregistered provider, so that might be, for example, me deciding that actually I want to pay my neighbour to provide the support because they are someone who understands me and understands my needs. And that they are accountable to me. So for those of you not familiar with Al Gibbs' work, she has written on this recently to disentangle the two arguments. So fraud is not the same as registration or not.
We have a few more minutes for questions if people had any further questions. Again, if you wanted to raise your hand or put it in the chat function. I had my own question. I guess one of the things that struck me was there appears to be a benefit, or people see value in being able to manage their plans, and certainly that value would seem to be central to the ideals of the NDIS, why the NDIS exists, to give people choice and control, and this is the way to do that. Did anyone talk about incentives? Because I guess the thing that struck me, and I think it was in the first quote that was listed by Diane, that there's a lot of things that, a lot of extra bills that people need to take care of, administer. And we also heard from Ray about the challenging HR type functions and like everything that role entails. Did anyone talk about incentives? I guess when I think about organisations get a unit cost that accounts for a provision of administrative charges that would largely go to the administration of and delivery of those funds. And I was just curious as to whether or not people saw that as a job function or a cost saving to government in that respect.
I think, Sally, maybe you can add to this, but my memory of the data around that was more from the perspective of people being able to get value for money by being able to make choices that they knew met their needs more specifically. And so rather than thinking about system value for money, they were speaking about personal value for money, being able to decide when to spend the money and how to spend it, and then saving it to spend at particular times in particular ways.
I think one of the main incentives, I'm sorry, I was slightly distracted because any example with a dog in it draws my attention probably more than it should. The question was about incentives and benefits at a systems level. Is that right, Paul?
Yeah, there's a benefit or an incentive to be able to manage your plan and make real choice, and to oversee how money is spent, and to ensure a level of transparency and accountability for others. But also there's a component that you are also doing that for yourself. So you're justifying, you're administering a whole lot of work that would otherwise be outsourced to a plan manager. Whether or not, I guess people spoke about, because that sounds like, for an organisation doing that work, they're charging lots of money. For a person with disability, it's almost an expectation. There's extra bills, and it doesn't seem right to me.
Well, in a sense, people didn't talk about it that directly from memory, but I think it was sort of a cost benefit in a way. Because the benefit was getting when it worked well, was getting the system out of your life a bit. Because when it worked flexibly and well, you didn't need to deal as much, or people didn't need to deal as much with bureaucracy and systems. And so if the cost of that was to do your own accounting and management, then that was a cost that people were willing to bear in order to get the benefit of being able to have control over the way that they organise their own supports. If that could be mitigated by using some of their funding to outsource some of their accounting to a billing company, for example, or a plan manager for people who wanted to have partial self-management. People had multiple ways of managing the things that were constraining for them as well, to sort of maximise the parts that they wanted and minimise the bits that were abrasive. But it only worked to an extent. So, for example, you could see that from Megan's data, the amount of the average plan was very small. And so it doesn't go a long way. So you have to make some decisions about whether you spend that money on financial accountability measures, or you spend it on therapies and support staff and equipment. So that then brings us back to the question about the risk of responsibility being pushed on to people with disability unfairly.
Thanks very much. Sally Ann, I'm aware that you've got your hand up. Our presenters today have generously offered to hang around and answer some lingering questions if people feel more comfortable with that. It is almost hitting 4 o'clock. I do realise we started at 3:02, but people are obviously welcome to come and go as they please, but we can continue having a conversation and offer the opportunity if people have some further questions of the presenters. And so I'll hand over to Sally Ann.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, everyone. That was a really great presentation. I'm so thankful that you're doing this sort of research because it's just so important. Yeah, thank you. So I think I had sort of two sides to one partially a comment and one a question, was that, yeah, it's interesting to see that the self-managed plans do tend to be lower. And I wonder if over time, they're actually allocated less as time goes by, or whether just because they do self-manage and they save some money, or whether you know, like, for instance, I self-manage a plan, not under the NDIS, under an aged care package. And one of my key incentives is to do it because it saves me money. And it means that my parents get more services. So it's interesting that those lower packages, you know, if you're only getting the 25,000, maybe that's a big incentive there. So that's just sort of a comment. But my question as well was whether you, and I'm really apologise if I missed it in the presentation, but I wondered if you were able to ask in your interviews why people chose to self-manage and whether they were encouraged to do so by either their local area coordinator or someone encouraged them, you know. I wondered if you were able to ask that.
People had a range of reasons for self-managing. So the report goes into a lot more detail about the qualitative research. So if you're keen to follow up, I'd have a look in that. But there's a whole diverse range of reasons that people choose to self-manage. A lot of it is, like you said, economy and stretching their plan as far as it can go. Some of it is about choice and value for money. So there's a whole diverse range of reasons why people have chosen to self-manage.
I was keen to hear about how much encouragement they got as well, you know. Somewhere in my experience, I had actually had people who were told, oh, definitely don't self-manage, that's just so onerous, you know. So if they're receiving that sort of information, that's sort of an interesting you know, or whether they got someone said, look, go for it if you think you could, you know, like even at that first meeting, whether they're even hearing that would be interesting too. But thank you.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at the report again, but my sense is that it's mixed again. Yeah, that people have mixed reactions.
I think that it's Karen. I think that's one of the examples of Peter's question, where it varied by location. And at worst, in some locations, people are discouraged from doing it. At best, in other locations, they're encouraged. And the interesting finding, I think, was the number of people who started with part self-management, learned about it, and then moved on to, in many cases, then fully self-managing.
However, just calling on the Kinsella framework, there were people in the study who went through so many different NDIA staff that they were encouraged, then discouraged, then recouraged, if that's a word, according to the different personnel and their priorities.
There aren't any other questions in the chat. We have had a few people leave, so there's a smaller group of us. If people feel more comfortable asking questions now, the floor is yours. Maybe give people a couple of minutes to ask questions if the presenters had anything else, any other pressing things that they wanted to talk about. It's also that opportunity. Carmel, thank you. Sorry, you're just on mute, Carmel.
Sorry, forgot about that. Thank you for this being really interesting. So where's the way forward? What's going to happen with all this? You know, we know the NDIA is varied and across states, or the supports across states. NDIA has information, but not a lot of personal support. You're telling us that peer support makes a huge difference, and that makes a lot of sense to me. So where to from here? What do you see the way forward?
So I think it's very encouraging that self-management is one of the priorities within the National Disability Insurance Agency. So there is a lot of policy development going on there, held up in the bureaucracy and politics, unfortunately. But there is a commitment to making this an informed option for more people. it's not that we, the data suggests that everyone should or will want to self-manage, but for those that do anticipate benefits from doing so, then I think the way that Sally presented it in terms of making sure that we have the resources and the structures that overcome the inequalities around socioeconomic advantage are really a priority that we would put on the implications from this research. So it's good, one, that the NDIA wants to pursue this, but second, from the perspective of these findings, the way to pursue it is to make sure that it's offered in a way that's equitable to people without those advantages.
Thanks, Karen. Unless there are any other questions, I think we have reached the end of today's presentation. I just wanted to say thank you so much for Megan, Sally and Karen for sharing your time, your research and your learnings. Certainly the comments that people are making in the chat function, and we've heard from a lot of people that it was well received, and I think a very topical and interesting piece of research, and hopefully will develop and I guess offer an opportunity to learn more and hear from more people about the constraints and opportunities for people to manage plans and not rely as best as possible, not rely on service providers in that, and hopefully reducing the amount of services in people's lives for those that want that. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks for everyone coming along.
Thanks for sharing, Paul.